everybody. We're getting started for our last session of the Telos Conference on Civilizational States and Liberal Empire. And in this panel, I'm Marcia from New York University and Humboldt University in Berlin. And we will have 4 people talking each for about 15 to 18 minutes. And then we will have questions from the audience. We have Joe Bendersky from the Virginia Commonwealth University, Marcus Charlesworth from the University of Ottawa, David Pan from the University of California at Irvine, and Jacob Ulmschneider from the Virginia Commonwealth University. And that last will be a virtual presentation on the monitor. I think that we can begin simply in order that we appear on the program. So we will welcome Joe Bendersky to begin our panel.
Thank you. Thank you. At the 2010 Telos Conference, I presented what some considered an overly pessimistic, even alarmist paper on Imperial Germany and modern China. Some considered it a highly speculative and perhaps a dubious and unwarranted historical analogy, but it was written in light of the Obama administration's 2009 shift from emphasizing hope and change in China to America's change in its approach to China. Abandoning earlier hopes of liberalizing China, the Obama administration's new policy of cooperation with China proved an equally utter failure, with not a single significant reciprocal concession from China. This new policy rested upon the assumption that such cooperation and the avoidance of a major conflict would be ensured by the economic interdependence of both countries, the rational self-interest model. My own historical consciousness, studies of the modernization of Germany, and observations of contemporary China caused me great unease that such self-confident assumptions were naive and dangerous. Comparing the authoritarian capitalism of Imperial Germany and modern China, I thought I had demonstrated how such an, or I sought to demonstrate how such an economic political system based upon nationalistic legitimation had thrust Germany through Weltpolitik and would also thrust China towards an offensive, aggressive foreign policy with hegemonic implications. You know, for example, though economically greatly interdependent at that time, Germany and Britain had become competitors. They were compelled into an ever-escalating international confrontation and ultimately war that no one wanted. And I also concluded that the intensifying US-China struggle was in fact more ominous because of factors different from those conditioning the imperial rivalries of Germany and Britain. A few years later, in 2015, Christopher Coker invoked a somewhat similar pre-1914 analogy in his book, The Improbable War, China, the United States, and the Logic of Great Power Conflict. If you haven't already done so, I would strongly urge you to read Coker's more thoroughly researched and certainly intellectually more sophisticated study. Given what has transpired in China in the last 12 years, I think it is worthwhile revisiting, in fact, repeating my earlier historical analogies and pessimistic prognoses. Here, one only need mention the more assertive, even arrogant attitude on the part of contemporary Chinese elites, as exhibited by Xi himself, and his own version of Weltpolitik and regional hegemony, reminiscent of the gross realm theory of Huntington and Schmidt. But before I go further, let me state that I am not proposing a policy of confrontation. I too believe that attempts at mutual accommodations are essential and that confrontation would be catastrophic. However, I am still worried and do not share the optimism of those whose hope is buttressed by economic or political arguments of rational self-interest or wishful thinking. Of course, earlier Western expectations that economic modernization would eventually culminate in the political liberalization of China have clearly been dispelled. But despite what has transpired in the past decade, Western corporate interests in Chinese markets and naive globalist tendencies are still quite prevalent. Thus, my continued unease, emanating essentially from my own historical consciousness and my observations of recent developments in China. Now, at this point, you are probably wondering, what does Wilhelmian Germany have to do with any of this? And by what right does a German historian who knows little of China even address these questions, especially after all the experts you've heard of the last 2 days here? I must concede that in taking up this subject, I'm abandoning my usual cautious orientation as a historian who likes to stick closely to archival documentation and avoid speculation. Nonetheless, I would like to engage once again in a brief bit of comparative history. I do so because Chinese modernization over the past half century does contain striking parallels to a similar German process. Of course, significant cultural and historical differences exist in the very nature of these countries, as well as in their developmental patterns. Still, I would argue these revealing comparisons are difficult to deny. These comparisons will not provide any lessons to be applied. Rather, they offer cautious insights regarding what can actually occur despite hopes and reasons to the contrary. And as I have indicated earlier, these insights are disconcerting. Let's look back 100 years to around 1910. By that point, decades of German modernization had reached its zenith. From a secondary power only beginning to industrialize in 1850, Germany had become an economic giant on the verge of outpacing the productivity and innovation of Great Britain. And its rapidly expanding population gave that country an unprecedented youthful dynamism, propelling changes in all aspects of society, economics, and culture. It had become a scientific and technological leader. Its middle and upper classes were increasingly preoccupied with economic materialism and consumerism. Accompanying the rising expectations of these classes was a psychological imbalance between their arrogance, chauvinism, and their inferiority towards an outside world they felt jealously denied them recognition for their achievements. The search for status moved from the domestic sphere to the world scene. But these prospering and dominating classes were equally disturbed by challenges emanating from within that would threaten their status and well-being, even their existence. Germany's economic achievement and prosperity was plagued by serious old and newly created contradictions in the very system producing the new Germany. For example, though economic growth had uplifted the working class from destitution, it still left them in an economically oppressed and deprived condition. The hostility generated by these class tensions was only one cause of that country's internal destabilization at the very point of great success. Despite all the jingoistic rhetoric of Deutschland über alles, Germany was still a land very much characterized by deeply rooted, often emotional, regional, religious, and even ethnic divisions and identity politics. The glue that held these disintegrating forces together was not the constitutional framework of Imperial Germany, but rather the authoritarian state. Neither was Germany's thriving market economy leading the country toward political liberalism and modernization. Similar to contemporary China, Imperial Germany had developed a form of authoritarian capitalism. Encouraged and protected by the authoritarian state, the market economy thrived. In the process, the original link between capitalism and liberalism had clearly been broken. Assumptions then and now about economic modernization gradually liberalizing systems along progressive democratic lines proved wrong. Instead of liberalizing the state, Germany's expanding and increasingly prosperous middle class had sold out to the old regime in return for stability and prosperity. The dynamic economic freedom unleashed in civil society had no counterpart in the political sphere. Equally important, that very authoritarian state now protected the prospering classes from demands and threats emerging from large segments of society, suffering the ill effects of this entire economic process. However, the authoritarian state could not eliminate these pressures from the discontented below. It could only hold them in check. And could only do so with increasing difficulty as working class consciousness of the disparity between their dire conditions and the general rising prosperity mobilized them for political action. The survival of the regime depended upon continued economic expansion to satisfy the supportive classes and to diffuse the pressures from below. But the regime's legitimation rested not only upon guaranteeing economic growth, but also upon promotion of a national identity that would supposedly supersede fracturing class, regional, ethnic, and religious pressures. The German state had to satisfy both the concrete economic requirements of markets and raw materials and simultaneously meet the psychological, emotional dictates of nationalism. Both requirements, in conjunction with real and perceived geopolitical security needs, thrust the country down the path towards Weltpolitik. Today, such Weltpolitik, world politics, is referred to as globalism or expansionism and so on. Economically, geopolitically, and militarily, this formerly German regional or continental power had thrust itself into the affairs around the globe. Nonetheless, Germany's new global orientation emanated from more than foreign policy considerations. Weltpolitik again revealed the primacy of domestic politics. The authoritarian state was having more and more difficulty maintaining control over the dynamic economic and societal forces unleashed by the very capitalist and nationalistic forces it promoted. This problem was further complicated with the rise of a military-industrial complex to facilitate global economic expansion and satisfy nationalistic appetites. In turn, the military-industrial complex accelerated the intensity of economic and nationalistic expectations. Indeed, the military-industrial complex developed its own economic and institutional interests that had to be continually satisfied. And it too now emerged as a power factor in domestic politics. While Germany was struggling with stability at home, it itself became the major destabilizing force on the international system. The building of the high seas fleet, like an offensive global foreign and economic policy, alarmed existing world powers who had difficulty adjusting to the newcomer. Nevertheless, its unwanted presence could be lamented, but not denied by the rest of the world. And the options for dealing with Germany sound disturbingly familiar: accommodation or containment, or a combination of both. And the arguments in favor of each also had a very familiar ring. Containment through military preparedness would supposedly deter conflict. But by 1910, containment had resulted in Einkreisung, a paranoid German mentality of encirclement. Feeling besieged from abroad and held captive at home by its own nationalistic rhetoric and legitimation, the German state had become less conciliatory. On the other hand, those optimistic about international cooperation felt that the very destructiveness of modern war would deter its outbreak. In addition, the optimists also emphasized the two great powers, Britain and Germany, were not only competitors, but also increasingly economically interdependent. Despite their naval and geopolitical rivalries, Britain and France were major trading partners. So rational leaders would not risk such human and economic destruction. Yet within a few years, these global competitors lapsed into an unwanted war that debilitated their economies. Now, throughout this brief historical excursion into late 19th, early 20th centuries, I could easily have inserted the word China for that of Germany. There are, of course, significant differences between these countries and time periods that should not in any way be downplayed. But these differences do not necessarily imply a better outcome. One major difference is that Imperial Germany had a constitutional system that allowed for elections of political parties. In the absence of such democratic options, China might contain its contradictions longer. But this means that economic development would not progress towards democracy. Furthermore, the German example actually shows that the weakening of the authoritarian state through the rise of democratic forces actually increased the possibility of international confrontation. Thus, if democratic forces did pressure the system from below, an authoritarian Chinese regime under duress might very well seek to reinforce itself by exploiting nationalistic sentiments, as well as emphasizing grievances and threats supposedly emanating from foreign entities. Three other factors distinguish contemporary China from Imperial Germany, and these seem to indicate a future of confrontation rather than cooperation. First, China, at a certain point in its economic development, will China try to free itself from American markets and fail to support the US debt as its own domestic markets emerge and its own global economic offensive begins to pay off. That would certainly greatly undermine cooperation based upon economic interdependence. Second, despite all the realpolitik and social Darwinism evident in Imperial Germany, its attitudes were still conditioned and to some extent constrained by both a liberal Enlightenment and a Christian value system. Such constraints are absent within a Chinese regime that had its origins in a communist ideology, which from the experts tell me is still dominating there, which rejects liberalism and Christianity. So an authoritarian, nationally legitimized Chinese regime might very well base its policies more upon sort of a harsh Hobbesian realism and power politics than Western liberal optimists appear to recognize. Finally, in its excursion into globalism, Imperial Germany had little it could exploit ideologically or emotionally in people around the world in its competition with other empires. But China has such a potential advantage in appealing to non-Western, non-white regions. Unlike the Soviet Union, a capitalist China can no longer hope to champion the downtrodden masses of the third world, supposedly exploited by imperialistic Western capitalism. China can, however, exploit the residue of anti-Westernism and accentuate this inherent grievance with appeals to race. In this regard, it would be worth studying whether the potential exists for Chinese nationalism to take gradually a racial tint. Someone raised this question the other day. It would certainly be ironic if a resurgence of global racial nationalism emerged at the very point when Western liberalism prided itself on the progress it made against Western racism. In posing such questions in this historical context, I'm certainly not predicting war. These are only insights about a world that is not flat, but rather bumpy, erratic, often irrational, and certainly potentially volatile. In 2010, I concluded by stating that I would prefer that trends in coming decades prove these purported insights to be utterly ridiculous. Unfortunately, 12 years later, they now appear not to be so ridiculous. One conference participant responded by saying that I had scared the hell out of him. And he asked, what should the US do? And today I would sort of advise the following, if you're looking at just general ideas. First, the US has to get its own economic house in order. Yeah? It can have no effective future foreign or military policy without this. Second, it must assert a unified national identity against the forces that are tearing it apart. In fact, the entire West must recognize that it does have a certain right to exist. It has a certain value system, a certain identity that should be cherished and defended. Third, the US must draw back from its liberal universalist interventionism. And here Huntington offers some sound advice. The US has neither the resources nor the inherent right to pursue its historical interventionism. Huntington's world is a multipolar, multi-civilization one divided by historically unique cultural identities. The durability of these distinct cultural groupings or civilizations belies the aspirations of both universal human civilization and a model of modernization leading to Western-style liberal democracy. It rejects interventionism in the name of universal humanity or Westernizing liberal democracy. It takes the world as it is rather than as some presume it ought to be, because the resilience and resistance of entrenched cultures ultimately dooms this misguided adventurism. Equally important, universalism and interventionism aggravate the tensions and sufferings of an already inherently dangerous world, often leading to disastrous but avoidable wars. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our next presenter will be Marcus Charlesworth from the University of Ottawa. You'll find that on your programs.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I say it's a real privilege to have been invited to speak with such interesting people, and we really heard some excellent things before I get to speak. I think one of the benefits of speaking towards the end is that it's really helped me to sort of locate. Sorry, should I speak up? Sorry, is that better? Okay, very good. Sorry about that. I think one of the advantages of speaking at the end is it's made it rather easier for me to locate the work that I'm doing, which on the face of it may seem somewhat incongruent with a lot of the presentations that we've seen within the broader themes of this conference. I think what is interesting about looking at this from the perspective of Canadian Indigenous thought is that we're really looking at a very small version of what I think we've seen on a massive scale with civilization states such as China and Russia. You know, the indigenous peoples of North America are particularly interesting in that they are continental peoples, right? They span the entire North American continent in this context. And so there is a diversity in their thought that you would have with an enormous continental nation like, you know, Russia. And yet the communities themselves are often very small, sometimes numbering only a few thousand people. And so we get to see, I think, an interesting interplay in scale, I think, when this is discussed in the broader context of this conference. Indigenous thought in Canada is something that is increasingly, I think, being tried to be integrated into the broader conception of the Canadian philosophical tradition. It's introduced more and more at undergraduate level. There's an increasing attempt to sort of have this be a part of the kind of core philosophical education that young Canadian students get. This itself has actually raised a number of controversies, which are, I think, particularly interesting from our perspective here. There is a critique that something is lost in the challenge that Indigenous thought may offer to the liberal myth of Canada as the sort of multicultural Garden of Eden or as the global village. That, you know, the Indigenous peoples of Canada have always been a sort of living repudiation of the kind of idealization of the Canadian multicultural myth. And there's a sense, I think, that this integration into pedagogy is potentially something which diffuses that critique. And there's a real concern, which was obvious to me as a student of somebody who studies nationalism, that this parallel about this fear of assimilation, you know, domination, homogenization, and the loss of traditional ways of life is shared in very interesting ways between a lot of the Indigenous theorists who I'll be talking about and particularists that we encounter in the Western tradition. I'll be focused mostly on Europe. Particularly, I think, important is the relation to place that occurs in that is relevant to the particularism in question. So in the Indigenous context, we have concepts such as grounded pedagogy, land-based epistemologies, which involve the natural world or the locale as a participant, not only in as a context in the way that one thinks, but as an actual sort of participant aspect of the process of thinking. So this is sort of the difference between land-based epistemologies and simple questions of context. So a couple of clarifications have to be made, I think, before I get into the substance of this comparison. The first I've hastily scribbled in just on account of my compatriot from the West Coast being here, but I am primarily focused on thinkers from Ontario and Quebec, particularly with coming from the Anishinaabe tradition and a particular theoretical movement sometimes referred to as Anishinaabe Renaissance, which is essentially from the Anishinaabe thinkers, usually at the University of McGill, but some elsewhere in Quebec and Ontario, who are focused on attempting to sort of revive Indigenous ways of thinking within the Canadian academic structures. Another thing that should be clarified is that I am not myself going to be using an Indigenous epistemology. There's some debate about whether or not I could do that, which itself actually raises interesting questions about the nature of the particularism that we're talking about. So there is, I think, enfolded into a kind of general progressive discourse about cultural appropriation, a sense that, that in some way it's wrong for non-Indigenous peoples or for white people in particular to try to use Indigenous epistemologies. This is controversial in the sense that historically, Indigenous groups in North America have actually tended not to have sort of strict ethnic characterizations of belonging. They've always absorbed people from around into their groups, often as war captives, but also just through kind of the coincidence of movements within their territory. And the non-hereditary nature of their group membership, which is, for those who don't know, I mean, to belong to an Indigenous band requires only really that you are recognized as belonging to it by the leadership. So it doesn't have an ethnic base. I think particularly interestingly, when we compare it with European nationalism, you also don't really have to speak the Indigenous language to be a part of one of these groups. And there's no particular requirement that you participate in Indigenous ways of life. So one can live in Toronto, go to U of T, not really participate in any kind of Indigenous traditional practices, and yet still be a part of one of these bands, which I think is an interesting contrast with the way that group belonging is understood in European nationalism, where we often have with Meineke and Renan, like it's neither the daily plebiscite, nor is it ethno-linguistic. So it's a particularly interesting type of belonging. Nevertheless, I wouldn't myself be able to do an Indigenous epistemology simply because it's not what I study. And I haven't, whether or not you need to be Indigenous, you would need to immerse yourself in some kind of tutelage, which I haven't done. So that's why I'm not giving you an Indigenous epistemology today. I'm also not intending to make any kind of political or normative association between the ideas coming from Indigenous thought and European nationalism. These things are just simply contextually very different. The political context these people are operating within. In one case, you have a minority which is particularly disadvantaged historically in Canada, which is often operating within the logics of survival. On the other hand, you would have an English nationalist who's potentially quite close to the levers of power. And so the potential political implications of the kind of strong sense of particular group belonging, manifesting politically, would be very different, I think, in these contexts. And so we shouldn't take away from the similarities that will be observed between Heidegger, who I'm going to be talking about in the context of European particularism. We shouldn't take from that the idea that Indigenous thinkers are dangerous or that they're Heideggerian. So I want to speak as well about civilization as a concept, as it's understood by Indigenous thinkers. This is important because the question of what the West is was raised yesterday. And I think a particular conception of the West tends to emerge when we read a lot of these Indigenous theories, which is related to what they will term linear thinking, is really a kind of either Whig history or kind of Hegelian view of history as teleological progress. The part of the Western tradition that critiques that tends to fall out of the picture a little bit in these analyses, which often leaves us in situations where we're told that certain things which make Indigenous thought unique, as somebody who studies Heidegger and anyone who would study a kind of linear part of the Western tradition would question, I think, the uniqueness of a lot of this stuff. So some of that has to kind of be taken as the rough that comes along with this. But it's particularly interesting, and of course it's historically understandable because most of the contact between these Indigenous thinkers and the West was primarily driven in Canada by a relationship with France and England, and the France and England which often at this time were driven by a conception of what we might loosely term mission civilisatrice, which is has become extremely controversial obviously in the context of the residential schools, and to the extent that you would be aware of it here, there was a potential discovery of what might have been some mass graves, and so this has been really major controversy in Canada, I would say, the last year and a bit. It mirrors, though, I think, a dynamic that develops in Europe, which complicates our discussion of civilization, where an initial association with Great Britain and France was complicated by its expansion across Europe itself, never mind getting into Russia and beyond. And so, whereas we are drawing an opposition between civilization and liberal universalism in this conference, it's complicated a little bit when we look historically by the fact that civilization has often been liberal universalism to a lot of its critics. So this is why German thinkers in particular use the term Zivilisation, or Civilisation, sorry, to critique what we are, I think, here describing more in terms of liberal universalism. So there can be some conceptual confusion that emerges when we move between these concepts. For the purpose of what I'm doing, I'm going to therefore use the binary of particularism and universalism rather than using the term civilization, just too much confusion, sorry. So I think I'll begin, and I had some questions about how much to do this, just because I'm not quite sure the exposure that this side of the border one would get to Indigenous thought, particularly not Indigenous thought from Ontario and Quebec. So I want to just draw out a couple of particularly interesting aspects of it. And I apologize if this will be boring because you've heard it before, but I'm sort of working on the assumption that this will be new to people. So there's an important dichotomy drawn by Paul Mahan between earth-centered knowing and human-centered knowing. And this is central to the claims made about the uniqueness of Indigenous thought. And the distinction is fundamentally between an attitude towards the earth and the natural world as, in Bacon's terms, something which is put on the rack and tortured to reveal her secrets, right? There's a standing apart from nature, and in Heideggerian terms, a kind of setting upon of nature, which is put by Mahan in opposition with earth-centered knowing, which is where there's a kind of co-equal relationship between the natural world and the human being living within it. It's sometimes understood within the broader concept of the natural order of things. There is a certain amount of romanticism to this, which one has to be wary of, I think, when taking this thought seriously, as we don't want to adopt a kind of conception of the noble savage, even if we're doing it from a kind of, position of benevolence. I think it's still sort of quite, it's quite problematic to use the fashionable term for it. But Mahan does give us an example, some substantiation of what it means to have a earth-centered knowing. And he uses it by describing the way that water is named and understood. He isn't specific about which Indigenous language, he just says many Indigenous languages, which is fairly unhelpful. But if we think about the way that water is characterized in English, it's understood in terms of the way that the physical properties relate to the person. So it's colorless, odorless, tasteless. Whereas in these unspecified Indigenous languages, water is understood in terms of its relation with us as a source of life. This is quoting, imbued with a life-giving and sustaining spirit. Also important, and I hinted at this earlier, is the question of epistemologies of place, land-based epistemologies. This is described in, again, through language by Niels Boubant, who's talking in the context, the non-North American context of Indigenous groups living in some islands in Indonesia, the Buli people they're called, and their understanding of location in the way that they, where we would say over there here, rather than being north, south, west, east, which is global in its point of reference. Its point of reference is entirely linked to the geography of the island. So a thing is either landwards of me or it's seawards of me, right? And so this is a notion of the way spatiality is understood. So not just the context in which we discuss spatiality, but the way that spatiality is thought itself is conditioned by the geography and the physical characteristics of the landscape that surrounds us. The theoretical concept from Indigenous thought that I want to bring to bear in relation to Heidegger here, though, is, and therefore to particularism in the West in general, is a dichotomy drawn between traditional and local knowledge. So Thomas Eriksson describes this as traditional knowledge is the asserted connection between cultural continuity of knowledge, which in the case of the Canadian First Nations is tied in with the oral tradition, but particularly with myths and legends in the oral tradition as well as oral histories. And local knowledge is closer to what I would describe in Boubant's case. It's a link between ways of knowing and particular geographic contexts. So in simple terms, traditional knowledge refers to those things that we know because we have inherited knowledge from our ancestors. In practice, this is almost any kind of pedagogical knowledge transmission. And, but it is here, I think, often being put in opposition to positivism or objectivism. Myths are an absolutely excellent example, and myths which are vital, I think, to European nationalism and European particularism, as much as they are to Indigenous ways of knowing, are an excellent example of the kind of traditional knowledge that's transmitted. Local knowledge refers to things that we know as a specific result of where we are. It often implies a relation with geographic landmarks, but also animals and non-sentient beings, which I'll get to a little bit later, but rivers, mountains, and such like. An important distinction, I think, to be drawn, because I've discussed the importance of myth in the European and Indigenous context, An important one is that the landscape in a lot of indigenous thought operates as a mythological protagonist. So this is a fairly important point of distinction. There's a melding of the physical and the metaphysical. So for example, we'd have earth beings. So in Peru, for example, there's a big Asangate, which is a mountain essentially in the Andes. And in the Great Lakes region, so that would actually include some parts of the States, you have the turquoise goddess of the Great Lakes. So these are not to be understood just as anthropomorphizations of physical geography in the way that one might talk of Mother Russia or of Britannia. You know, these are actual subjects, right? They're subjects with whom it's understood that one could interact. So there is an interrelational aspect to the relationship with physical geography, which emerges from this. This is understood as a third dimension of knowing. This is the term of Thomas Fixico, who's from the States, she's an American-Indian theorist. And it places the indigenous thinker, I think, in an interestingly Platonic position, with sort of one foot in each camp, right? One foot in the metaphysical, one foot in the physical. And as I said before, it's not merely a question of the context being shaped by this landscape. Local knowledge implies a direct relationship between the community's way of being in the world and the specific physical geography of the place. So I'll just wrap up by bringing in opposition the understandings of traditional knowledge that can be derived from Heidegger's thought and from Donald Fixico. So important similarity is that both understood tradition to be more than a set of practices, and that our relationship with them is not a simple one of imitation for the sake of participating in, folksy and enjoyable cultural traditions. For Fixico, tradition operates via what Heidegger might term a bestowal. So there is a gift of truth, a gift of knowledge, which one gains from participating in these traditions. The tradition itself and the practices, which are often, the famous example would be something like a spirit quest, but there's dances, there's all sorts of a really wide variety of practices here. And that these practices are not to be understood to be methodologies, because it's really a bestowal rather than a way of getting something acquisitively from being, if you want to use a Heideggerian term for it. Heidegger, I think, also understands tradition as something that we kind of commune with. There's a sense of receiving gifts. Heidegger does use the language of bestowal. We're thrown into a world of Heidegger which is forestructured by that which comes before. And it is from that forestructuring and that tradition that we're, as he puts it, summoned to being. Sorry, is that 3 minutes?
It was 3 minutes.
Okay.
Now it's find an elegant way to.
Very good. Sorry about that. Okay. Well, I'm sorry. So I'll wrap up. I'll finish then with traditional knowledge, and then we can maybe discuss local knowledge and questions. An important distinction, though, for me is that I don't think Heidegger fully escapes from a kind of Cartesian conception of the independent sort of floating cogito, as much as I think he's, understands his project as being an attempt to escape from this. This is an insight we get from this comparison. We're still able to step away from tradition in Heidegger in order to make evaluations. A lot of his project is a critique and a rejection of the metaphysical tradition. It's not clear with Fixico that this is the kind of relationship that within indigenous paradigms one could have with tradition. He's capable of criticizing things that indigenous people have done in the past. He's very critical of the practice of slavery, for example. But there isn't the same kind of theoretical distance that it seems in Fixico that we don't have that same capacity to take a kind of distance from the tradition in order to sort of look upon it from the outside. So I'll wrap up there.
Our next speaker, as you can see in your program, is David Pan from the University of California at Irvine. Do you want to see?
Yes. Thank you, Marcia. We're going to be speaking about human rights. So the question of human rights has become inextricably bound with the issue of the structure of international order and a corresponding global conception of culture. If the discourse of rights establishes a universal standard, the cultural expression of this universality would imply a global conception that integrates different cultures into a single discourse. Critics of human rights have asserted, however, that this discourse is a Western invention that has an imperialist character. According to this critique, the discourse of rights does not establish a set of universal standards, but rather a notion of international order that marginalizes alternative cultural conceptions. In this view, liberal internationalism seeks to integrate the whole world into a single framework with a unified Western-dominated conception of ethics. But the universality of human rights does not necessarily require the expansion of a single cultural conception. Rather, this universality only needs to describe the way in which there is a general aversion by all peoples to having their own dignity violated. Human rights are only universal in the sense that no one would like to be considered to belong to an inferior class of humanity, and all would like to be able to determine their own destiny. Within this universal aspiration, different cultures will have their own traditions and conceptions. This universal aspiration must contend, however, with the idea that some people belong, with the opposing idea that some people belong to a privileged class of humanity. There's a clear distinction between those who promote the idea of the fundamental dignity and equality of all humans and those who insist on the primacy of some subset of humans over others. Whether the dividing line lies in the belonging to a particular race, religion, or caste, the differentiation of humanity into different classes of humanity that have different rights continues to challenge the human rights idea. Consequently, the promotion of human rights involves the defense of a particular ideal of equality against its opponents. But if the human rights ideal has such opponents, the establishment of human rights must be considered as part of a political conflict that can involve war. The sudden need to take a position with regard to the war in Ukraine has illuminated the way in which the ideal of human rights implies political choices. Rather than a purely legal position, the ideal of human rights involves a particular conception of global order that attempts to establish itself against alternatives. While the discourse of human rights has emphasized international law as a primary path for guaranteeing such rights, the anarchic character of world order has meant that human rights as a practical matter have been protected primarily by nation states through their political decisions rather than courts and their judgments. Moreover, human rights depend on the nation-state order itself. Not only do nation states bear the primary responsibility for defending human rights, both within their borders and in other parts of the world, the organization of sovereignty into a system of nation states is itself essential to the ideal of human rights. Internationalism presupposes nationalism. Support for the international order entails a commitment to the primacy of nation states as the main locus of political power and decision-making. This dependence of internationalism on nationalism stems from the way in which the nation state establishes a unified popular will as the basis of its legitimacy, making self-determination in the formation and maintenance of this will into the goal of political order. At the same time, national identity as a concept requires an international order that recognizes the nation state as the primary locus of sovereignty. Human rights and nationalism are thus inextricably linked. Many of the key threats to human rights involve attacks on the nation-state basis of sovereignty. Demands of ethnic groups or religions for superior status lead to attempts to establish transnational conceptions of identity, such as Pan-Asianism or Islamism, that would seek to become the basis for sovereignty. One could imagine a world in which sovereignty is based, for instance, on religion, and in which religious affiliation would constitute the basis of political identity. In such a world, however, shifting religious beliefs would lead to political changes that would redefine regional antagonisms. Rather than allowing cultural differences to exist side by side within different nation states, such transnational conceptions of identity attempt to expand their reach territorially, threatening the nation state segregation of cultural difference. Such transnational conceptions of sovereignty refer to the pre-Westphalian organization of political identity. The boundaries we draw between civilizations today depend partly on the structure of international order in the era of the Crusades, for example, in which the boundaries between the Roman Catholic Church, the Orthodox Church, and Islam define the cultural space of each religion as the theological basis for political sovereignty. Accordingly, the contrast between these religious spaces defined the structure of conflict between in this world order. The significance of religious form as the basis for political legitimacy in this period formed the overarching theological context within which cultural life developed, and this framework for cultural life defined the terms of political conflict. Not only could church authorities exercise influence over political issues within Latin Europe, for instance, the church was also able to define Islam as an enduring political enemy. But this organization of sovereignty also coincided with a territorial organization of boundaries between these religious regions that was undermined during the Reformation. The emergence of nation states and national languages in the early modern period redefined the structures of both political life and cultural expression away from religious traditions. The shift of political sovereignty towards state structures and the accompanying replacement of Latin by vernacular languages as the basis for cultural life led over time to the establishment of national public spheres as the primary spaces for discussion and debate. Consequently, the civilizational understanding of political and cultural identity was gradually replaced by nation-based cultures and political boundaries. This shift toward nation states was also a shift away from a notion of sovereignty grounded in God and toward the nation, and thus the character of the people as the basis of sovereignty. Because the nation was based in the will of the people, the state was expected to serve the people rather than the other way around. Such an understanding of the relationship between the people and the state could then become the basis for the civil and political rights in human rights discourse. Civilizationally organized culture disappeared with the establishment of the nation state. Today's conception of the civilizational state is consequently not a return to the pre-Westphalian structure of sovereignty. Rather, today's idea of a civilizational state refers to the way in which the emergence of the nation state occurred in conjunction with European colonialism. Because the emergence of nation states coincided with the European circumnavigation of the globe, the formation of European nation states resulted in the establishment of nation-based empires. These empires were not like pre-Westphalian ones, such as the Holy Roman Empire or the Islamic one. If Catholic theological debates could still influence the development of the Spanish Empire in the 16th century, such theological considerations were no longer pertinent for the emergence of the French and English colonial empires. The structure of global relations was now dominated by conflicts between European nationally based empires. This meant that as national debates and national literatures became the determiners of political aspirations and conflicts, the aspiration to national sovereignty became linked to the goal of gaining an empire. The link between nation and empire resulted in two different conceptions of national culture. As Hannah Arendt has argued, the politics of the nation state reinforced liberal values and human rights, while the politics of the European transnational, pan-Germanic, and pan-Slavic movements formed the basis for 20th century totalitarianism. We can see this dichotomy clearly in the development of German national identity in the 19th century as both a Republican endeavor to shift sovereignty toward the nation and the imperial project of using national unity and power to create a German colonial empire. Nazi totalitarianism was not a return to the politics of the Middle Ages, in which political sovereignty was inseparable from the legitimacy granted by church authorities. Rather, the Nazis continued the nation-based colonialism of the French and British empires, in which national self-determination became linked to imperial conquest. The only restriction on such conquest was the will of the nation. The nation state established not just the cultural basis for a national public sphere, but also a political form that could mobilize masses of people into large citizen armies. The success of the nation state for the formation and outfitting of such armies allowed the European nation states to subjugate much of the world and integrate it into a European framework of world order dominated by these nation empires, or these nation-based empires. The imperial aspirations of these nation-based empires eventually led to the catastrophes of the two world wars, in which French, British, German, and Russian nation-based empires competed for dominance. The post-World War II era was significant because of the willingness of the European nation states to give up their imperial aspirations, as other parts of the world were able to emerge into a post-colonial order by developing their own nation-state structures, though with varying degrees of success. The establishment of human rights ideals has consequently been enabled by the proliferation of the nation-state form, in which the basis of sovereignty is held to be the will of the people, but in which this will limits itself to maintaining sovereignty within its territory without seeking to expand its political reach based on imperial or transnational claims. By contrast, the ideal of the civilizational state attempts to return not to the pre-Westphalian model of sovereignty, but to the model of the nation-state-based conception of empire. The difference lies in the way in which China and Russia strive, for example, to establish cultural homogeneity within their states, rather than establishing a basis for order within which different cultures could coexist. China, for example, has gone through a process of nationalization since the end of the dynastic era. It's striving today to establish the universality of Han identity within China by suppressing Tibetan and Uyghur identities, demonstrates the way in which its notion of civilization is, in fact, a continuation of a nationalist dynamic along imperialist lines. The idea of a civilizational state is a political idea that also claims to set aside the nation-state orientation of international order by providing an alternative philosophy of history. While the nation-state depends on a collective will of the people to establish the parameters for a national identity that reinterprets the past in terms of this identity, the idea of a civilizational state presumes a civilizational history that defines identity by means of previous influence that predetermines decisions in the present. Such a focus on civilizational history takes the contents of a past cultural tradition as defining for value orientations and order in the present. This focus on the determining character of a past tradition discounts the centrality of the concerns of the present for determining the interpretation of the past. Just like the myth of German racial superiority, the myth of the Russian or of the Chinese civilization serves today as a way to establish a particular interpretation of the tradition as the definitive understanding of that past. As with the Nazis, the current notion of the civilization state seeks to suppress alternative understandings of the nation in order to justify a form of nation-based imperialism that links national identity to a neo-colonialist project. Whether in Xinjiang or Ukraine, this project does not provide a civilizational framework for order that will be able to mediate between different cultures. Rather, it seeks to expand the nation by subjugating neighboring peoples and shaping them with totalitarian means into new carriers of the national culture. The difference between the nation state and the civilization state as the basis of world order does not hinge on the shift from ideology to culture as the basis of political conflict, as Huntington suggests in the class of civilizations. Rather, the difference between the two today depends on the self-understanding of a nation about its collective identity and goals. If Western Europe lies on the one extreme of retaining national identity while largely giving up on the ability to influence other nations' politics, the US maintains a notion of national identity that is linked to the enforcement of international order upon the basis of the nation state as the primary definer of political sovereignty. This international order accords with the support of human rights as a consequence of the sovereignty of nation states. Meanwhile, Russia and China have opted for an expansionist understanding of the nation. They arrive at such a stance not through the force of a civilizational trajectory that flows out of the past, but through decision-making in the present about the imperialist character of their nationalism. Their threat to the international order of nation states consists in their attempt to return to the form of a nation-state imperialism. Thank you.
For our last speaker, Jakob Ulmschneider, we need some technical assistance because it is a virtual presentation. So how do we do that? Okay, stay tuned. He's on. Excellent.
Hello, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm talking about some of Paul Piccone's ideas that came together late in life. And I'm just going to go ahead and jump right in if everyone can hear me and everything's working. In the wake of Soviet collapse, the end of the Cold War, and the assertion of Western hegemony physically, intellectually, and financially, theorists in the Telos circle, and principally Paul Piccone, cemented their break with the Marxist orthodoxies of the New Left and attempted to chart a theoretical course informed by their proximity to Eastern European dissidents and a heterodox emphasis on the particularity of nations and peoples. Piccone began, from the end of history moment of the early 1990s, to construct a theoretical corpus predicated on understanding the post-Cold War world through the lens of concrete particularities, unshackled from the dyadic system that had hitherto restrained their expressions of distinctiveness and autonomy. To a significant extent, Piccone's theoretical expectations and analyses prefigured the ruptures of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, and given the concern he evinced with regards to subnational identity as the precipitator of modern conflict, in contrast to the proxy conflicts generated by the Cold War binary, he adroitly identified trends that are eminently relevant in the context of contemporary geopolitical conflagrations. Prior to 1991, Piccone, and in his conception, Telos as an institution, had comfortably articulated the Cold War as the reciprocal legitimation of two fundamentally irrational systems, with which the Telos project was engaged in a manner designed to transcend the typical orthodoxies by which the New Left understood and criticized the mechanisms of Soviet and Western governance. For Piccone, this examination meant understanding both the Soviet and liberal projects as projects of homogenization, whose fundamental aim was the constitution of bureaucratic entities capable of engaging in the kind of rationalizing, centralizing project upon which both liberal and communist governance theoretically relied as the sole viable mechanism for modernization and the self-perpetuation of their respective systems. The collapse of one half of this binary and the subsequent reconfiguration of the sole remaining superpower's external relationships would, in his analysis, open a space for theoretical inquiries emphasizing the concrete individuality of subnational and culturally particular entities. For Piccone, understanding individuality through the lens of, quote, subjectivity constituted by social and historical relations within which it is embedded, rather than as merely, quote, abstract individuality, a mythical, self-given atomic entity operating within a corresponding mechanical universe and consisting of an aggregation of similar atomic entities, was a critical component of any post-Cold War analysis that sought to discard what he perceived as the shared emphasis of liberalism and Marxism on abstract universalisms. Piccone felt that the absence of valid analytical categories in the body of liberal and Marxist philosophy rendered them equally unfit to contend with the imminent ruptures of the 21st century. Indeed, by the early 1990s, in contrast with his work in the 60s and 70s, he had largely come to feel as though both Marxism in the form of the New Left and liberalism in the more pernicious but similarly misguided form of the New Class evinced the same irrational and incorrect analytical assumptions and could thus be collapsed into a singular category defined solely by its obsolescence. This basic outlook, predicated on emphasizing localisms and particularities and a disdain for bureaucratic homogenizing projects, would characterize his work from the end of the Cold War until his death. For Piccone, the liberal and Marxist views of nationhood were essentially incompatible with post-Cold War realities that would inevitably include the reassertion of previously subordinated national local identities that had hitherto been excluded from the prevailing legal political definition of nationhood. He felt that liberals and Marxists have no way to interpret these legalistic definitions as the bankrupt historical projects they are, as failed attempts to codify politically and organize territorially predominant norms and practices. Consequently, they cannot distinguish their particular manifestations from new regional formations demanding local and political autonomy. Instead, liberals and Marxists, quote, can only approach nations as contrived, historically obsolete, and vague political aggregations, waiting to be displaced by irresistible globalizing trends. This apparent inability to understand nationhood as nothing more than a legal manifestation of political sovereignty, rather than as collections of peer and affinity groups for whom concrete rootedness in local connections and traditions derived from equally concrete socio-historical traditions, was enormously consequential in their inability to correctly diagnose or contend with the transnational pathologies of the post-Cold War era. Instead, the liberal project, with the ascent of the vestigial Marxist left, who, in Piccone's view, had become either irrelevant or subsumed into the hegemonic edifice of homogenizing state policy, pushed forward in this post-Soviet bloc with the same destructive policies that had been critical in the extension of neoliberal market dynamics throughout the rest of the former Third World. What had been, in Piccone's words, the project of unifying Europe in order to create a third superpower to counterbalance the US and the USSR, soon degenerated into an administrative boondoggle, leaving the participating countries practically as there were, but compounded the existing centralizations with another layer of bureaucratic obstacles to the kind of development now necessary to compete effectively with the sole remaining superpower. This pattern of engagement, where Western interactions with peripheral post-Soviet states are defined more by externalities, and certainly not by the democratic assent of those states' citizens, has been a key element of US and European engagements with Ukraine in particular, where, prior to the Russian invasion, it was regarded and treated as largely a source for cheap labor, sinecures for Western political elites, biopolitical exploitation, and a mechanism by which the assertion of Russian geopolitical goals could be stymied at no physical risk to Western soldiers or businesses. Whether Russian grievances regarding Western agendas rooted in homophobic, reactionary, and religious rhetoric, genuine security concerns regarding NATO expansion, and other loudly voiced and often ignored complaints are indeed legitimate, they nevertheless emanate from precisely the dynamic identified by Piccone in his writing during the post-Cold War period, which was marked by the socioeconomic integration and Europeanization of post-Soviet states and bookended by the September 11th attacks. Indeed, the catalyst for the September 11th attacks, in Piccone's view, quote, suggests that what was attacked was what many in the Third World have for years indicted as an oppressive, monolithic Western system bent on destroying their local cultures, institutions, and ways of life. An argument which dovetails with Russian claims, however cynically deployed they may be, that Western impositions and demands are attempting to erase the autonomy and distinctiveness of Russian orthodoxy and government. Despite the morally distasteful defense of fundamentalism and meddling inherent to acknowledging the legitimacy of these grievances, Piccone correctly understood parallel historical complaints as a reaction to a foreign policy that, quote, reserves for itself the right of intervention into any country without having to respect national sovereignty, while at the same time remaining unaccountable to anyone but its own well-mediatized domestic constituency. The reactions on the part of states subjected to this system, in his view, thus merit addressing on their own terms, rather than merely as in a vacuum defenses of objectionable social or state policies. This dynamic is at the root of Piccone's arguments. The notion that geopolitical interactions can be framed with generalizing concepts such as civilizational clashes in the model of Huntington, or in terms of currently existing national identity, is one that he felt fails to acknowledge the emerging multipolarity of a world unfettered by the bipolar influence of competing superpowers. Though the general point regarding the emergence of a polycentric world is increasingly widely acknowledged, the polycentric model proposed by mainstream intellectuals is still generally predicated on the same national models that have always prevailed, e.g., that Russian or Chinese assertions of regional power conflict with attempts to assert the waning hegemonic power of the United States and its client polities. For Piccone, however, the devolution of power units to mere states, rather than the state aggregates of the Cold War, was insufficient to understand the precipitating factors that would be associated with conflict in the 21st century. Having identified the degree to which peripheral states were reacting to the imposition of Western values and economic models, Piccone naturally understood that within the context of this reaction, there were further subnational and local identities upon which future conflicts would inevitably be contingent. The general term used by Piccone to understand the character of these subnational or particular identities is localism, which for him possesses specific characteristics or the aspiration to manifest them. Localism for Piccone is both an analytical lens and a model through which he came to believe qualitative social change could be achieved. Local identities throughout the world have, in this view, been ruthlessly subordinated to national and international entities designed to perpetuate a centralizing, homogenizing, transnational apparatus. In his analytical model, civilizational categories are at best tertiary and at worst dangerous manifestations of precisely that reductive view, which seeks to collapse discrete, historically constituted categories into manifestations of universal tendencies more easily integrated into the world system. Localism for Piccone must be predicated on the popular assertion of sovereignty maintained by concrete connections to local systems and often manifests itself in contrast to the tiers of civilizational and national discourse, and its relevance to contemporary conflicts in Eastern Europe and elsewhere is largely contingent on the degree to which an observer is willing to accept these competing claims of democratic legitimacy. Localism, wrote Piccone in spring 2001, after spending nearly a decade refining his ideas in this area, or populism, has to be unbridled or it is nothing. Whenever it results in what, from different cultural perspectives, appear to be excesses or violations of human rights, it can be chastised and punished only by another stronger localism on the basis of the latter's free and thus necessarily arbitrary decision not to permit certain practices to take place. In this view, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in particular, the claims surrounding the supposed self-determination of the People's Republics in Crimea, can easily be understood as a reaction to the attempted integration of Ukraine into the EU sphere and a manifestation of concrete affinity groups, such as Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and their attempts to assert popular autonomy. Western objections surrounding the sorry states of human rights in the Russian Federation and the importance of Ukrainian self-determination tend to elide precisely the objections made in this same vein by Russian interlocutors. The point is not that either side enjoys the absolute moral legitimacy to render their claims or actions legal and acceptable, but that the contested space of particular and thus genuinely popular sovereignty within the broader international system is indeed the under-acknowledged catalyst for these conflicts centering on former Soviet states. Western observers tend to raise understandable objections to this logic, reasoning that, despite their obvious imperfections, the liberal democracies of North America and Western Europe are characterized by a type of moral accountability and substance that cannot be found in their Russian counterparts, thus the harping on distinctions between Western plutocrats and Russian oligarchs, and contrast between illiberal systems of measuring consent and Western representative democracy, and so on. Piccone, however, perceives the general idea of human rights as it exists in the legal political discourse as one that is cynically deployed to erase cultural particularity, and does so in a particularly sinister way by simultaneously failing to concretely protect the freedoms, both positive and negative, it ostensibly embodies, and by being instrumentalized to erase manifestations of freedom that lack the universal character embodied by Western definitions of human rights. Instead, he perceives the discourse of human rights to be a metaphysical abstraction used to justify realpolitik expansion of the administrative homogenizing apparatus, unrelated to authentic protections for individuals. Writing, quote, "The 20th century ended with a real liberal, rather than democratic, momentum. There has been no real turning point after the Holocaust, and human rights apply only to populations who do not really need them, while those whose human rights are systematically violated, such as Kurds, Palestinians, Chechens, and Afghans, are routinely ignored. Thus, these abstractions are used as de jure justifications for gross violations of precisely the freedoms they purport to protect, while simultaneously precipitating geopolitical conflict emanating from the populations upon which they are imposed. On top of this distasteful imposition, Piccone perceives the broader discourse constitutive of human rights to be inseparable from the pious, abstract legalism and secularized Protestantism that he describes as one-sided and characterizing the West, explaining that while human rights violations are really violations, not in the abstract, it is only so if the particular perpetrator has explicitly agreed to abide by international or national mandates, legally defining certain practices as violations of human rights, subject to censure and punishment. And thus, when the US, NATO, or the UN intervene to chastise or punish countries or groups engaging in these violations, they do so not as neutral executors of transcendental mandates, but as political subjects making particular political decisions. That these particular political decisions tend to serve the interests of homogenizing transnational entities is the reason such powerful political entities promote them so vigorously. This question, the solution to the question of universal human rights as localism is, as ever, for Piccone at least, the cultivation of concrete patterns of social relations that embody those rights in the absence of external homogenizing forces. He asserts that in contrast to charters and legal mechanisms from which imperial powers are broadly exempted, Real protection against anti-Semitism or other practices violating human rights is ultimately other neighbors unwilling to put up with anti-Semites in the community. Thus, the real function of human rights is not primarily to protect the individual against the group, but to legitimate a central regulatory apparatus over individuals and communities, while at the same time weakening real democratic controls. Indeed, in Piccone's view, the weakening of local democratic controls and apparatuses is itself a violation of the community right to the autonomous assertion of their interests. And localism is the only legitimate mechanism by which human rights or democracy can be transmitted or manifested. Corollary to this is an assumption that any external interventions are necessarily part of the homogenizing apparatus of Western liberalism and capital. Piccone's criticisms of the universalizing concepts that constitute the body of international legal theory can, at first glance, be read as a defense of the most odious practices that the transnational jurisprudential body ostensibly aspires to suppress. A deeper reading, however, reveals that he shares the liberal Marxist distaste for what he characterizes as really violations, and concludes that the cynically deployed body of interventionist justification that has hitherto sustained this model is less likely to genuinely protect human rights and more likely to advance the material interests of their most flagrant and persistent violators. In 2001, anticipating the deluge of violence the West would soon unleash in Afghanistan and Iraq, Piccone aptly summarized his beliefs regarding the possibility of constituting meaningful, shared, and persistent protections for human rights. The paradox of human rights ideology is that its deployment implies the erosion and destruction of precisely those conditions, traditions, and customs without which human rights become impossible to practice. Only through the curtailing of homogenizing
I'm going to
forces.
jump in for just a moment because
Sure.
I have no other way just to give you a heads up that you have should be wrapping up.
Yeah, I'm just about done. We'll have one more paragraph. And I'll be
Sorry
done.
to interrupt.
Thank you.
Okay.
Only through the curtailing of these forces can meaningful and perennial notions of human rights be transmitted from one generation to the other and concretely manifested. Any alternative system merely results in the conflation of human dignity with abstract legalisms imposed externally and resisted collectively. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much to all of our contributors and panelists. And I think we'll follow the practice of collecting 2 or 3 questions and then doing 1 or 2 rounds of those. So please. Yes. Okay.
Thanks, Carl. Hi, my question is for Marcus, please. So again, Andrew Wender. And as someone who also lives in Canada, I can attest to what you indicate about the degree to which the society has been riven by the question of indigeneity. And it actually, my question really, for me, as I was listening to you, there's a powerful linkage back to the panel following Christopher Coker's talk yesterday, and the question about self-belief in a society as opposed to a degree of self-critique that essentially tears the society down and apart. As you were speaking, I was thinking what goes on in Canada surrounding the question of indigeneity is almost akin to the 1619 Project in the United States, except with an even greater degree of societal and governmental buy-in, arguably. And then over the past week, finally, the papal apology that came to Indigenous communities over the residential schools question is a potentially a profound step with respect to the theme of the conference, because the question is this: to what degree does Canadian engagement with questions of Indigenous sovereignty and so forth open up the possibility for a meaningful intra-civilizational critique, particularly now that it extends in this overt way to the papacy rather than just within Canadian society itself? Thank you.
Second, and then in the back. Yeah, that will be the.
Thank you. I think this may be the last time I speak publicly here, so I want to thank David, Adrian, and Mary, and everybody else for this remarkable event. Obviously, the question of universality and particularity is a very old one, and it's been dealt with in a variety of ways. I'd like to introduce a term into this conversation I haven't heard this weekend, but maybe it's somewhere there in the shadows. Subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is one of the three pillars of Catholic social teaching, as launched by Pope Leo XIII in the late 19th century. The other two are human dignity and solidarity. I'm currently teaching a course online on digital Catholic social teaching, and will be leaving this event to go teach my 6th session. So my question is, this was really brought up in the presentation around Piccone and localism. Subsidiarity is neither flat nor hierarchical. Subsidiarity says that decisions should be reached at the lowest possible level that can take the responsibility of the decision. So I'm wondering whether Piccone or anyone else in reference here might have been aware of the series of encyclicals, might have been aware of how the church tried to apply this, and how that might in turn apply to the question of civilizational states and liberal empires.
Third
You can
one.
speak to that a little bit. One more question though, right? Yeah.
Let's see. Thank you for the amazing panel. So my question has to do with the notion of empire, because it has been present with Joseph's presentation and also with Andrew. So do you think that this notion or sort of empire notion can be applied in the international order today? At the same time, David's presentation was very rich. I hope I was able to follow everything. Sorry, I'm a little bit tired today. But anyway, you were talking about the distinction between the national state and civilizational states. And my question also is, can we consider that all civilizational states are going to have some intention of becoming an empire or some sort of domination, you know, like, because you were talking about different examples. And so do we have to imply that any civilizational state, because we have you give examples of Asia, you know, Islamism, you know, so. And finally, about human rights. So you were also explaining the character of universality, but at the same time, we can see how in different cultures, we can have a look at different maybe interpretations. I'm not an expert on human rights, but I think that that's not good at all. That's very dangerous. And even if we have different cultures, but we should always reach to some sort of minimum or minimum substratum for human rights. Thank you so much.
So we have intra-Canadian critique on indigeneity, subsidiarity, the inevitability of civilizational states moving to domination or empire, and a comment about the minimal required of human rights. Let's start. Indigeneity.
Yeah, I would say I agree. I mean, I think you're correct to notice that as a possibility, especially as, and I think this is one of the things that's quite interesting about the topic, is that there's both a real specificity and also more of a universalizability than you might think to some of these questions, right? Like, it isn't actually only the Americas where we have seen the construction of civilizations requiring the kind of attempt to either destroy or assimilate out of existence pre-existing peoples, right? I mean, we've seen, obviously, in the linguistic sense, the destruction of non-French, you know, non-modern French languages in France, but also the ancient Britons, and, you know, plenty of Cornish people will tell you that they're somewhat like the indigenous people of Britain, right? And so there is something that is transferable about the challenges that are being raised by a lot of these indigenous thinkers, and particularly as a result of the kind of traditional epistemologies that I was beginning to talk about, that however, you know, odd it may seem sometimes from our perspective, like the sense that you can commune with ancestors and they can speak directly through you. It allows for a kind of witness on the part of the dead to be presented to us in such a way that, you know, that could be potentially quite useful as paradigms when we begin to think about the broader question of the like this intra-civilization, particularly you're talking about. I also think at the more practical level, when we talk about discussions across civilizational boundaries, you know, part of the reason I clarified that I was talking a bit more about East Coast Indigenous peoples and Ontario and Canadian is that, you know, because you don't have horses, distance is, you know, actually much bigger essentially in Canada, which is already an enormous country pre-contact, right? So the difference between the sort of West Coast Indigenous group and the East Coast one is vast. I mean, it's as great as the difference between, you know, a Russian and a Peruvian. And so the experience that particularly in the modern context, the kind of leadership of Indigenous communities in Canada have of trying to get people together who have extremely different ways of viewing the world and of viewing being, and to be able to sort of communicate between them, I think is also something that could be potentially useful when we talk about inter-civilizational discussion, right? And we don't, I think, in Canada, anywhere near take enough advantage of that experience in our diplomacy, where I think that, you know, Indigenous leadership in our diplomacy could be potentially like very, very useful for us as we try to, you know, understand how somebody like Vladimir Putin is thinking.
Anyone on subsidiarity?
Yeah, I can speak to that a little bit, particularly with regards to Paul Piccone and the relationship he might have had to that. By the time he was coming up with these ideas between the early 90s and his death, he was pretty Catholic. I think that at this point, Paul Piccone was deeply influenced by the Catholic idea of subsidiarity, and that power can only be democratically legitimate if it has been validated in the most popular way possible. And that at this point, he really felt that populism was the only way to manifest any kind of genuine freedom or human rights, and that populism must necessarily devolve to sort of the lowest possible power unit. And the idea that the individual could only be protected through this devolution, I think comes a lot from his Catholic background, and something that had initially been in my paper, but I omitted it, but his Italian heritage. He felt strongly all the way to the end of his life, at least as I've read his writing, that Italy is one of the best examples of an artificially imposed homogenizing state project, where the constellation of Italian lifeways, subnational identities, and religious manifestations of Catholic doctrine had been attacked and erased by Italian state building projects. And I think that some of his bitterness or unhappiness that these distinctive, and you know, he thought they were beautiful and worth sustaining, cultural elements had been erased, really influenced him later in life.
David, did you want to say something?
Sure, yes. So, yeah, I really appreciated the paper on, Senator's paper on Paul Piccone, because, you know, what I'm thinking about in terms of human rights and subsidiarity is that even though I guess I have a lot of sympathy for the support for local culture, I still see the nation state as really the basis for political sovereignty, and therefore also really the place where issues of human rights really have to be located in terms of you know, what's the authority that's really going to be defending human rights. Now, if it's on the level of the nation state, it means that internally it will be also the nation states that it is going to have to sort of that's going to have to establish the kind of ground rules for relationships within that nation state, and that includes relationships between local cultures, and I guess setting expectations for you know, for the behavior of those local cultures. So I mean, obviously in the United States, you know, the establishment of really I guess our modern form of the nation state was really through the Civil War. And it really involved, you know, I guess you could say a struggle between a kind of nationalist version of the United States and a localist version that would have included slavery. So in a sense, then, the support of human rights was really on the level of the nation state against that local autonomy. So that is not to say that the nation state needs to somehow totally suppress local culture, but it does need to set some ground rules for order within the nation state. And that's the way in which I see that subsidiarity functioning, in the sense that, yes, you want to devolve that sovereignty to the lowest possible organization or level, but yet you do need to have also the nation state as somehow a guarantor of a kind of minimal level of human rights. That applies also, though, to the nation state's role with respect to other nation states in the world, in which human rights are always, they're not going to be adequately defended through legal international law, but really have to come down to conflicts between nation states. And here, I mean, you indicated this question about the difference between civilizational states and nation states. And I guess my argument is really that the idea of civilizational state is really just a kind of ideology of certain nation states that really want to establish a kind of nation state imperialism that's still based on structures of the nation state, because I really see China as, through the course of, the 20th century, transforming itself into a nation state to the extent that it really has pursued, particularly in the last, couple, 2-3 decades, a kind of homogenization of the population of China to harmonize it with the sort of Han Chinese majority, where it's clear with Tibet and Xinjiang, where there's really this very calculated process in which they're really trying to erase the cultural particularity of those regions. So I'll just stop there.
That actually links to our fourth question that we had about the minimal guarantor of human rights, and what is the entity that would enforce such a minimal guarantee, and also the question of whether civilizational states, as you just said, David, if that's an ideology of a particular kind of nation state, does it always predict a power grab beyond its borders, some kind of imperial or extraterritorial power grab? Joe, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, I wanted to.
Yeah.
Just that. Yeah, I don't think necessarily that has to be the case. I think it depends upon the culture, the foundation of it. If, however, one of those civilizational states sees itself not just as a separate civilization with its own integrity and interest and so on, but has a civilizing mission beyond that, which carries with it a kind of universality, yes, and there's a kind of the Zionism in there, maybe a historic teleology to it then, but I don't think it has to be inherently such at all. On the other hand, the notion of a civilizing mission can also simply be a rationale for traditional expansionism, but elevating it to some, the cosmic justification or legitimacy here. But I don't think it has to be.
Yeah, so we have now quite a few. We have Miles, Russell, and thank you. We'll do those three and we'll see how much time we have. Thank you. Yeah. Miles.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for this wonderful panel and for this opportunity for me to participate in this pretty amazing event to talk about some of the deeper issues that you don't normally get a chance to talk about in Annapolis and Washington, D.C. So I began my remarks on Friday by talking about a new kind of category that is sort of the clash of instead of civilizations, but between freedom and tyranny. I mean, that sounds a little bit corny, but I think I went through a great extent to explain what I actually meant by that. And also, I'm very thrilled to see this conference ended with the discussion of human rights. And then we also have several categories talking about. I just look at the title of the conference: states, empire, and we talk about civilization, culture. And how does those concepts square with human rights? And which reminds me of this very deep discussion in 1948 at the United Nations, when the United Nations was drafting the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that was actually very telling to me, because by that time, the world just emerged from the devastation of totalitarian states, right? Either in Germany or in Soviet Union. So my reading of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that rights actually is fundamentally individualistic. It's individual rights versus state. So in other words, when we're talking about what's the best way to guarantee human rights, we're talking about whether either nation states, civilization, or any other benign or malign government can guarantee individual rights. So it seems to me, none of those categories actually matter because human rights is fundamentally individualistic. Without the emphasis on individual rights, either right to move, right to seek asylum, you read the declaration, it's pretty specific, it only makes sense when applied to individual. So, I mean, we'll go back to the founding principle of American unalienable rights. Everybody has it. So I think it's a beyond of the civilizational definition. I don't know what David, I was particularly inspired by your talk. So what you take on that?
We're going to collect Russell's.
Thanks to all the panelists. On the subsidiarity question, I know for a fact that Paul was thinking about the Catholic legacy of subsidiarity. However, he inflected it through a phenomenological reading of life world. And out of that comes a notion of localism with a slight anarchist twist to it. I tend to agree with David that nation states are vital for the defense of rights. If you don't have a state, you're not going to have rights. End of the day, you know, which then raises the question of who is the, as Marcia asked, you know, who's the ultimate enforcer of human rights? I think if we're honest, it's very difficult to come up with the case of a nation invading another in order to defend human rights. For all of the egregiousness of the past centuries, I can't think of any nation that invaded another one in order to protect victims of human rights violations. I can think of invasions. I can think of invasions because of infractions of international borders, maybe because of war crimes. That's something that matters. But an invasion because someone has been denied freedom of speech, I don't think so. What's what? Oh, all right, there's one exception, Tanzania, Uganda, but no one, we're not engaged in Ukraine now. We're not engaged in Ukraine now, period. And we're not going to be engaged in Ukraine now because of human rights violations. We might be engaged because of a infraction of international borders.
This is a comment for David. I think I get your drift, but I want to make it more explicit. As far as I can tell, and correct me if I'm wrong, the whole human rights discourse in American politics begins with Jimmy Carter at the level of government. And there's been an awful lot of mostly Democrats and liberals using that type of human rights discourse. And now you have them in Princeton. Now Blinken is also making those claims. So there's been an awful lot of people trying to do that type of thing in American society, in levels of government, and that has come and go, and now they're trying to maybe revive it a little bit. So I would like to get your take on that, because you haven't made that, you've been quite silent about that big section within American society. I can see, even in the context of this Telos conference, that there are some sectors within republicanism now making claims for human rights. So I would just like to hear from you whether you like what the liberals are doing with human rights, because I mean, Jimmy Carter is going to be the name that is not going to be mentioned in American political life. It's considered to be a big defeat, not only after the whole Iran situation, but so that is one official beginning of the human rights discourse, American government. And there's been an awful lot of different movements, different schools of thought. So I would just like your engagement with that. Do you like what the liberals are doing now?
Before we hear from the in-person panel, there are two people that I'd like to bring in. First, Chiron Skinner, and then Courtney Hodrick. Chiron, can you join us?
Yes, I can. Let me get the camera on. Thank you. Yet again, I'd like to thank Mary and David for the conference. This is just a fascinating panel. What a great way to end. There's the panelists were all excellent, and I think they built on what we've been talking about for the last couple of days and added lots of new arguments and facts. Let me just mention a couple things and respond to some of the questions in the audience. I'll start with human rights, since we kind of have been having that conversation. And I'm so pleased that someone mentioned President Jimmy Carter. I think he does get lost in the conversation about rights in globally and domestically. And he did make that an early pillar of his foreign policy. The problem is that the Carter administration ended up punishing friends and ignoring enemies on human rights. And so it never, in what was to be the big human rights project of the post-war era, it actually failed. And it gave way to what we now call the neocons, because the very Democrats who had signed on with him, the Jeane Kirkpatricks of the world, abandoned him on this failed human rights policy in part, which led to her famous essay, Dictatorships and Double Standards, in Commentary. And that group became part of the brain trust of Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign and helped him build a much more robust human rights policy, which allowed him to not make the mistakes that Jimmy Carter did, and to become really the only global human rights president of the Cold War era, for some of the reasons I talked about yesterday, in terms of really objective, palpable measures of advancing global human rights. And Jimmy Carter was never able to do it because of the moralistic part. And I think just an lack of understanding by his own team, and really lack of commitment to it. This whole discussion, number 2, on the nation state is fascinating. I had a lot of talks with Russell while at the State Department about it. And I think the sense of the group is right. The nation state matters. It will be the enforcer. It is the place where economic opportunity and protections of people will take place. There's no other unit of analysis that can do what the nation state does for all of its many problems. Interestingly, Donald Trump reasserted the theoretical conversation about the nation state into American political discourse. If you look at every UN General Assembly speech he gave, it's a body of theoretical work about the role of the nation state in the international system, sovereignty, political and territorial integrity. He gets little credit for it, again, for the reasons I think Jimmy Carter gets little credit for human rights. Trump had a State Department leadership, not the careers, that betrayed him, didn't advance his intellectual agenda, kind of went rogue for a whole host of reasons. And I'm now coming to the conclusion that if you don't have a Secretary of State who is in lockstep with the president, then you will not get the full expression of a president's theoretical moment. And I think that really happened with Trump, sadly. And then third, I just wanted to make a quick point about China. I just kind of dropped a little bit of a story there and didn't go very far yesterday. I think we could see, if history is any guide, a global racism movement that could have a soft lead by the Chinese, or maybe a more aggressive one, if history is any indication of that happening. In the 30s, I go back to that, the Japanese and Chinese Americans, but some really supported by their governments, were competing for African American support, not only in Harlem, but especially there, also down south, in terms of making their case against the other. And there's just this interesting moment in the 30s around the Manchuria invasion, where Chinese and Japanese thought leaders show up at meetings in Harlem, reported only in the Black press, the New Amsterdam News, where they're really talking about each other and saying we're the ones that will liberate the colored peoples of the world. There's still a residual effect of that in parts of the African-American thought community. The Japanese won out, but in that debate, and many African-Americans were on the side of Japan at the time of Pearl Harbor and beyond. But I just think it's worth thinking about for the future as we look at this competition or whatever we call it with China. Thank you.
Courtney, did you want to comment as well?
I had a question. First of all, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So my question is primarily for Joseph and has to do with the internal debates within German studies about the so-called Sonderweg thesis. And my question is about the extent to which the falling out of favor of the Sonderweg thesis may or may not have led to a sort of failure to anticipate China following a similar path as you've outlined in your talk, but then sort of broadening from the German studies specific context, to what extent are narratives of normative modernization useful or counterproductive in thinking about human rights and geopolitics? Thank you.
So I'm going to have Joe respond to that, but then let the rest of the panel give some closing thoughts, given the time, about these questions of human rights, individuality, universality, and enforcement. Small topics.
Good. Thanks for the question. It actually is sort of complex as various dimensions. It's been a long time since I dealt with the Sonderweg. Let's see, for a long time had no longer adhered to that interpretation of German history. And I hope that today I did not imply sort of a parallel development in China. I don't think China is following some special path similar to the so-called Sonderweg of late development and so on. My sense about let's say my critique of Chinese let's say of models in that case was that was trying to reinforce the critique of the old modernization theory of political liberalization. That economic modernization would automatically lead to, liberal government, liberal democracy. I do not believe, I criticize that hopefully today, so I do not adhere to that at all. And what was the last part of your question there about you? Sorry.
Basically, what is the value of narratives of normative modernization? It seems like you've just answered that.
Yeah,
but
okay. No, I don't. Again, maybe at one time it was used to try and explain a lot. Everything goes back to Barrington Moore already. Over the peasants, through the peasants, and so on, to modernization. I don't think that model holds up at all. That doesn't mean that there aren't, important aspects of modernization itself. But that teleology, I don't believe, holds up. It hasn't for a long time. I don't know anyone who uses it.
Okay. Marcus, final.
Final thought. Do you have something you want to say?
Sure.
Okay, it might not be the nicest way to end, but unfortunately, I think when you have a discussion of human rights, and speaking with a reference to the indigenous context, you're somewhat condemned to being the turd in the punch bowl a bit here, because fortunately, the whole apparatus of the residential schools were genuinely conceived of as being in the best interests of the indigenous people. There was a conception of the rights of these peoples being advanced through those schools. And it brings to mind for me Hannah Arendt's critique of the concept of human rights and the origins of totalitarianism, the human shorn of any specific characteristic, any particular characteristic, becoming almost a kind of bare life. And in obviously in the indigenous context, that was, the family, the language, the religion, all stripped away in the name of advancing the human understood as a pure abstraction. So as I said, that's probably not the best note to end on. So
Let's have David, and then we can come back to you. And we also want to hear from Jacob before we wrap up. David, do you want to plunge in?
Yeah, so great questions. So I guess starting out with the issue of human rights and the sort of the origins with Carter. I mean, I think, I guess I'm kind of placing it within a kind of longer trajectory of the development of the nation state order itself, right? So, the nation state order, with, sort of in the 17th century establishing itself at the same time as colonialism meant that European nation states, France, Great Britain especially, really were establishing themselves as empires as well as nation states. And so that dynamic created these nation state empires, and Germany sort of took that as a model for its own aspirations. That exploded in the 20th century with World War I, World War II, right? But it was really only in the aftermath of World War II, and really by the time, I guess in the 70s, where France, Great Britain had sort of renounced their imperial aspirations by then, post-colonialism, and also other parts of the world were coalescing as nation states as a result of the post-colonial revolutions. And so it was really not until that period, like in the 70s, where you really had, I guess, the makings of the nation state order that we see today, in which sovereignty is generally recognized as in the nation state. That's the standard place of sovereignty in the international order, and it's also it also becomes the place in which human rights have to be defended. Obviously, Miles, you're absolutely right that that human rights pertain to individuals, but as individuals, they can't defend those human rights. They need some kind of authority in order to politically defend them, and that role has devolved onto the nation state. And so the defense of human rights, I really see the defense of human rights as coincident with the defense of the nation state order as such, because it really has ended up being the nation states that have that responsibility for defending human rights. Now, clearly, some nation states don't do this very well, right? But we can see that as sort of those are I guess the nation state really is also important because it really is supposed to be the expression of the will of the people. Even the horrible nation states, right? In some sense, you could say that they have to be understood still as the expression of the political will of the people, and as such, they can be, I suppose, censured or I mean, clearly, even if we have had no interventions for the purpose of defending human rights as such, we have certainly had interventions in order to protect the sovereignty of nation states. And I think that those types of interventions, in fact, also are really de facto the types of interventions that we see that would protect human rights. And then finally, on this issue of cultural traditions, now I think so one of the difficulties of human rights discourse, especially the kind of discourse that you get that wants to base into human rights and international law, is that it really does. I think there is a problem there. This is the one that Paul Piccone was pointing out of a human rights discourse really trying to kind of erase cultural tradition in favor of a kind of unified kind of ethic, a kind of international ethic. And so I think what we have to do, and I think this is one of the strengths of the report of the Commission on Unalienable Rights, is that you really, I think you have to understand defense of human rights as a kind of an attempt to look at each individual tradition and support interpretations of that tradition that accord with a kind of human rights ethic. So you can't just say, okay, here's a set of norms, we're going to just apply them to everybody. You have to really look at each culture. I mean, certainly you've got examples in China, for instance. You've got the wonderful example of China versus Taiwan. Taiwan certainly has the same cultural tradition, but it's obviously interpreting it in a different way, right? And part of what we would want to be doing in order to support human rights would be to look at these individual traditions and to support those impulses within those individual traditions that do accord with a notion of respect for human rights. So, and that would be the way I think that we really have to understand this idea of civilizational states as really, I think, just a kind of an ideology of states that really want to somehow undermine the nation state order that is so key to human rights, and trying, I mean, I don't think that they really have. See, I mean, the goal would be like China to establish a kind of new type of basis for world order, but it would be a kind of imperialist basis of world order that would try to replace the nation state basis. And so that replacement is really, I think, what's at stake here, I think, in this kind of discourse of civilization states. Thank you.
Jacob, did you want to say any final wrap-up comment? And then Joe, I think you wanted to have a final wrap-up comment. Jacob?
Yeah, you mentioned Russell, he mentioned the phenomenology of Piccone's writing, which I actually think kind of ironically his emphasis on the immediately tangible, the perennial, and what he always characterized as the concrete, sort of these things that can be located in history and understood to be persistent and rooted in local traditions as phenomenological, kind of ironically made him miss some of the concrete realities that we nevertheless have to contend with, whether we like it or not, like the nation state. And so I tend to concur that, you know, in the contemporary world, which is what it is, the nation state is indeed the guarantor of human rights. And I think for Piccone, I look to him and his phenomenology essentially as sort of an aspirational model. David just mentioned the possibility of these future orders that might replace the nation state, and in doing so, endanger the possibility of these guarantees of human rights. And I think that reading Piccone is something that is best understood as him proposing an aspirational model for the possible replacement of these currently existing systems. And I think what he often failed to articulate in the whole body of his work was how exactly that would be accomplished. You know, and I tend to think that it's sort of a slow process through social development, and like David also said, understanding the particular manifestations of cultural tendencies that can also be concordant with the universal expectations of human rights. And so I think there's a deep tension there between the phenomenology and, ironically, the actual reality of trying to accomplish these things.
And to the baton goes to you for the final moment.
Yes, and maybe this is not the time to raise this question. I think the discussion has been too narrow with regard to the origins of human rights. Weren't human rights also inherent in sort of universal Christianity, especially in the modern period, inherently there? Also, you see something similar in 19th century peace movements, late 19th century, early 20th century peace movements, promoting a good deal of that. With regard to American policy, long before Jimmy Carter, you had Woodrow Wilson and his liberal progressivism, his idealism, which drove the Europeans crazy, because they thought they referred to him as the parson, the preacher of this whole thing here and all this here. There's a kind of liberal idealism inherent in that, his policy there. In Germany in the interwar period, there were all kinds of actual movements for human rights and organizations for human rights that were functioning then, and certainly within the Truman administration. Yeah, there. Yeah. So, again, last word.
Okay. In light of the time, we are just a little bit over time. I'd like to thank everybody who participated and presented, and all of you for asking questions and joining in. And of course, the John D. Calandra Institute and Mary, where's Mary? And Mary doesn't have time to be thanked because she's working on our behalf, but we will thank her and all of you.